میرے بیٹے، میری آنکھ کے تارے، میرے دل کے ٹکڑے، تم پر بھی سلام ہو۔ پھر وہ کہنے لگے، امی جان، سلام، تمہیں اجازت ہے؟ پس حسین بھی دونوں کے پاس رسول آپ پر سلام ہو، کیا مجھے بھی اجازت ہے کہ میں آپ کے پاس چادر میں آ جاؤں؟ بابا جان نے فرمایا، تم پر بھی سلام ہو میرے بھائی، میرے وسیع، میرے جانشین، میرے علم بردار، تمہیں اجازت ہے۔ پس علی علیہ السلام بھی چادر میں پہنچ گئے۔ پھر میں چادر کے قریب گئی اور میں نے کہا، سلام ہو آپ پر بابا جان، اے اللہ کے رسول، کیا میں بھی آپ کے پاس چادر میں آ جاؤں؟ بابا جان نے فرمایا، تم پر بھی سلام ہو میری بیٹی، میری لگتے جگر، تمہیں بھی اجازت ہے۔ چنانچہ میں چادر میں چلی گئی۔ اب جو ہم سب چادر میں اکٹھے ہو گئے تو بابا جان نے چادر کے دونوں کنارے پکڑے اور دائیں ہاتھ سے آسمان کی طرف اشارہ کرتے ہوئے فرمایا، اے اللہ، یہ میرے اہل بیت، میرے خاص لوگ اور میرے حامی ہیں، ان کا گوشت میرا گوشت اور ان کا خون میرا خون ہے۔ جو انہیں ستاتا ہے وہ مجھے ستاتا ہے، جو انہیں رنجیدہ کرتا ہے وہ مجھے رنجیدہ کرتا ہے۔ جو ان سے لڑے گا میں بھی ان سے لڑوں گا، جو ان سے صلح رکھے گا میں بھی اس سے صلح رکھوں گا، جو ان سے دشمنی کرے گا میں بھی اس کو دشمن سمجھوں گا، اور جو ان سے دوستی رکھے گا میں بھی اس کو دوست جانوں گا، کیونکہ یہ مجھ سے ہیں اور میں ان سے ہوں۔ اے اللہ، تو اپنی صلوات، برکات، رحمت، بخشش اور خوشنودی میرے لیے اور ان کے لیے قرار دے، اور ان سے نجاست کو دور رکھ اور انہیں نہایت پاک و پاکیزہ رکھ۔ صلوات۔
اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد۔
پھر اللہ بزرگ و برتر نے فرمایا، اے میرے فرشتوں، اے آسمان کے رہنے والوں، میں نے یہ مضبوط آسمان، یہ پھیلی ہوئی زمین، روشن چاند، چمکیلا سورج، گھومتے سیارے، تلکتا سمندر، تیرتی کشتی، یہ ساری چیزیں صرف انہی 5 افراد کی خاطر اور ان کی محبت میں پیدا کی ہیں جو چادر کے اندر ہیں۔ اس پر جبرائیل امین نے پوچھا، اے پروردگار، یہ چادر کے اندر کون لوگ ہیں؟ اللہ بزرگ و برتر نے فرمایا، یہ نبی کے اہل بیت اور رسالت کا خزینہ ہے۔ یہ فاطمہ، ان کے بابا، ان کے شوہر اور ان کے دونوں بیٹے ہیں۔ جبرائیل نے عرض کیا، اے پروردگار، مجھے بھی اجازت دے کہ میں زمین پر اتروں اور ان میں شامل ہو کر چھٹا فرد بن جاؤں۔ اللہ نے فرمایا، تمہیں اجازت ہے۔ پس جبرائیل زمین پر اترے اور کہنے لگے، اے اللہ کے رسول، آپ پر سلام ہو۔ اللہ بزرگ و برتر آپ کو سلام کہتا ہے اور آپ کو درود و احترام سے سرفراز فرماتا ہے۔ آپ سے کہتا ہے کہ میری عزت اور بزرگی کی قسم، میں نے یہ مضبوط آسمان اور پھیلی ہوئی زمین، روشن چاند، چمکیلا سورج، گھومتے سیارے، پھلکتا سمندر، تیرتی کشتی، یہ ساری چیزیں صرف تم لوگوں کی خاطر اور تمہاری محبت میں پیدا کی ہیں، اور اللہ نے مجھے اجازت دے دی ہے کہ میں بھی چادر کے اندر آپ کے پاس آ جاؤں۔ اے اللہ کے رسول، کیا آپ بھی مجھے اجازت دیتے ہیں؟ رسول اللہ صلی اللہ علیہ وآلہ وسلم نے فرمایا، اے اللہ کی وحی لانے والے، تم پر بھی سلام ہو، ہاں تمہیں بھی اجازت ہے۔ پھر جبرائیل بھی ہم لوگوں کے ساتھ چادر میں آ گئے۔ اس کے بعد جبرائیل نے میرے بابا جان سے کہا، اللہ آپ لوگوں کو وحی بھیجتا ہے اور کہتا ہے واقعی اللہ نے یہ ارادہ کر لیا ہے کہ آپ اہل بیت سے نجاست دور رکھے اور آپ لوگوں کو پاک و پاکیزہ رکھے۔ صلوات۔
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد۔
مجھے رسالت کے لیے منتخب کیا۔ اہل زمین کی جس محفل میں ہمارے پیروکار دوست اکٹھے ہوں اور ہماری یہ حدیث بیان کریں گے، ان پر اللہ کی رحمت نازل ہوگی، فرشتے ان کو حلقے میں لے لیں گے، اور جب تک وہ لوگ محفل سے رخصت نہیں ہو جائیں گے ان کے گناہوں کی بخشش کے لیے دعا کرتے رہیں گے۔ اس پر علی علیہ السلام نے کہا، اللہ کی قسم ہم اس وقت کامیاب ہو گئے اور ہمارے پیروکار بھی کامیاب ہو گئے۔ پھر رسول اللہ صلی اللہ علیہ وآلہ وسلم نے فرمایا، اے علی، اس ذات کی قسم جس نے مجھے سچا نبی بنایا اور لوگوں کی نجات کی
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد۔
Could I please request the donation of forms to the trip in exchange for all the additional housing that will arrive a little bit? Thank you so much. Jazakallah.
صلوات۔
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم۔
تاثیر کا لا الہ کی تہ کے نیچے خون ہے شبیر کا، لا الہ گیا شبیر کا لا الہ الا اللہ محمد رسول اللہ الا زوال درس گاہ حسین ہے نہ جس کی کوئی مثال ہے نہ جس کی کوئی نظیر ہے.
محمد وآل محمد صلوات.
حسین روح کائنات ہے حسین فخر معجزات ہے حسین روح کائنات ہے حسین فخر معجزات ہے. خدا نے جس کو مرحبا ہے نفس مطمئن کہا وہ کربلا اللہ محمد دستگاہ حسین ہے. اے ہاشمی جوان کیا ہوا کہاں چلے گئے ہو باوفا. اے ہاشمی جوان کیا ہوا کہاں چلے گئے ہو باوفا. صدائے فاطمہ کی رہ گیا میرا حسین ہے لا الہ الا اللہ محمد رسول اللہ الا زوال درسگاہ حسین ہے. حرم میں حشر کا سما ہوا صبح سے جب سکینہ نے کہا حرم میں حشر کا سما ہوا پھپھی سے جب سکینہ نے کہا مجھے نہ نیند آتی ہے لا الہ الا اللہ محمد رسول اللہ الا زوال درسگاہ حسین ہے. حسین دین کا شباب ہے حسین درد کی کتاب ہے حسین دین کا شباب ہے حسین درد کی کتاب ہے. کفن کے بند کھول کر بلایا جس کو ماں نے کھول وہ فاطمہ کا لاڈلا حسین ہے لا الہ الا اللہ. حسین ہے مگر ڈٹا ہوا پسر جوان کی لاش پہ ہے مطمئن کھڑا رہا کہ وہ خلیل کربلا حسین ہے لا الہ الا اللہ محمد رسول اللہ الا زوال درسگاہ حسین ہے. اپنے خون کا غسل ملا کفن ہے جس کا ملا کفن ہے جس کا کہ محمد رسول اللہ الا زوال درس
محمد وآل محمد صلوات.
باری دیگر بآواز بلند صلوات. اللهم صل علی
محمد وآل محمد.
مجھے مطلوب ہوگا جام لینا جب کوثر کا سلام ایسا پڑھوں گا دل بھر آئے گا پیمبر. سلام ایسا پڑھوں گا دل بھر آئے گا پیمبر کا. زمین کربلا کیا پوچھنا تیرے مقدر کا. زمین کربلا کیا پوچھنا تیرے مقدر کا. ہے تجھ میں آج تک محفوظ سرمایہ پیمبر. ہے تجھ میں آج تک محفوظ سرمایہ پیمبر کا. کمر خم کیوں نہ ہو دل ہم سے ٹوٹے کیوں نہ سرور کا. کمر کیوں نہ ہو کمر خم کیوں نہ ہو دل غم سے ٹوٹے کیوں نہ سرور کا. علم بردار آخر بھائی تھا بازو برابر. علم بردار آخر بھائی تھا بازو برابر کا. لبے دریا علم بردار بھی کام آ گیا آخر. لبے دریا علم بردار بھی کام آ گیا آخر. بس اب اللہ حافظ حضرت زینب کی چادر. بس اب اللہ حافظ حضرت زینب کی چادر کا. گھڑی بھر بھی رباب آرام سے سونے نہیں پاتی. گھڑی بھر بھی رباب آرام سے سونے نہیں پاتی. وہ جب کروٹ بدلتی ہے خیال آتا ہے اصغر. وہ جب کروٹ بدلتی ہے خیال آتا ہے اصغر کا. سعید زار پر جب بھی کوئی افتاد پڑھتی ہے. سعید زار پر جب بھی کوئی افتاد پڑھتی ہے. بس ایک عادت سی ہے وہ نام لیتا ہے حیدر. بس ایک عادت سی ہے وہ نام لیتا ہے حیدر کا. مجھے مطلوب ہوگا برما دعا.
ہم میں سے ہر انسان محمد و آل محمد دیدہ و دل بلند آواز میں درود پڑھتے ہیں.
اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد.
موت کے سیلاب میں ہر خشک و تر بہ جائے گا. موت کے سیلاب میں ہر خشک و تر بہ جائے گا. ہاں فقط نام حسین ابن علی رہ جائے گا. آپ تمام مومنین سے گزارش ہے کہ تمام مرحومین مومنین مومنات کے لیے، بالخصوص میرے والد محترم جن کی آج برسی ہے ان کے لیے، اور حاضرین کے جتنے بھی مرحومین مومنین مومنات ہیں، شہدائے ملت جعفریہ، ان سب کے لیے ایک مرتبہ سورہ مبارکہ الفاتحہ. بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم. الحمدللہ رب العالمین. للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات تابع بيننا وبينهم بالخيرات إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك على كل شيء قدير.
Tonight, inshallah, perhaps I'll get an answer for a question I've had for a long time. How can I see my Imam? And to help us do that is our keynote speaker, Sayyid Heydar, Jamaludeen. Let's welcome him with a passionate Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
نعرہ تکبیر، مل کر نعرہ تکبیر، نعرہ رسالت یا رسول اللہ، نعرہ رسالت یا رسول اللہ، نعرہ حیدری حیدری بر حبیب خدا ختم الانبیاء بآواز بلند صلوات.
اللہم صلی علی محمد و آل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد والثناء لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين ثم الصلاة على سيدنا ونبينا وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين المظلومين المستشهدين، لا سيما بقية الله في الأراضين، روحي وأرواح العالمين بتراب مقدمه الفداء. ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من حين عداوتهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Inshallah, by the eyes in order to be able to one day hopefully see our Imam. But as we mentioned over the last few nights, it's not important to see our Imam, correct? What's important is to truly see him. You know, as we mentioned that even Shimr saw his Imam, right? Shimr saw him right in front of him. But it doesn't matter, because all that matters is to come together, to come here, to sit here, to listen here, to mourn here, to cry here over Abu Abdullah Hussein, a mercy that is unequaled to any other mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala given upon us. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this blessing that Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam says, and he says, من أنشد في الحسين عليه السلام شعرا فأبكى 50 فله الجنة. Whoever recites a poem by Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam and he makes 50 people cry, for him is paradise. This is one of the most profound hadith you can find. وَمَنْ أَنْشَدَ And then he continues, وَمَنْ أَنْشَدَ فِي الْحُسَيْنِ شَعْرًا فَأَبْكَى ثَلَاثِينَ فَلَهُ الْجَنَّةِ. And whoever makes 30 cry with a poem, for him is paradise. And he keeps going down, he keeps mentioning, the 13, then he goes down to 20, then he goes down to 10, then he goes down to شِعْرًا فَأَبْكَى وَاحِدًا فَلَهُ الْجَنَّةِ. If somebody recites a poem and makes just one person cry, that person is worthy of paradise. Does it stop there? No, it goes even more. He says, وَمَنْ أَنْشَدَ فِي الْحُسَيْنِ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَامِ شِعْرًا فَبَكَى. Is paradise. Does it finish there? Not even. He says, وَمَنْ أَنْشَدَ فِي الْحُسَيْنِ شِعْرًا فَتَبَاكَى فَلَهُ الْجَنَّةِ. If somebody, he recites a poem, or he recites a Marsi, or recites Masayib of Abu Abdullah Hussain alayhi salam, and he pretends to cry, doesn't even cry, a tear doesn't fall out of his eye, he pretends to cry over Abu Abdullah, for that person's paradise. So brothers and sisters, when you recite over Abu Abdullah, and your tears fall from your eyes, or not even your tears fall from your eyes, even a single person becomes teary-eyed because of you, not even a single person becomes teary-eyed because of you, they pretend to cry because of your recitation, for you is paradise. So simple. That's why they call Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, it's the ark of salvation, brothers and sisters. There was a story of one of the great ulama. He wouldn't really recite Masa'ib or much like, Masa'ib at the end of his lectures. And then one night he had a dream. He was a great marja, very, very great marja. And he saw that he was in the plains of, Muzdalifah, the plains of Qiyamah essentially. And he sees there are two lines. There's one line which is extending until, miles. And there's another line which people are just going in and they're walking in to paradise. So he goes to the line where there's, he asks, what line is this? The one of the miles. So this is the line of the Maraja. This is the line of the scholars. It's his turn. He gets to the front, he sees Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam is sitting at the front, and he's checking each and every one of those alims, risalas and their books. So when he gets to the front, Imam al-Sadiq stops him for a long time and he says, look, you made a mistake here. When did I say this? How did you come to this conclusion from my words? And so on and so forth. And eventually, he's not allowed to enter through the door of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. So he realizes, there's another door over there. People are entering really fast. He goes to the door and he sees that it's a door of people who have made people cry over Abu Abdullah Hussain alayhi salam. So he goes there and he requests to enter, and they say, well, you haven't made anybody cry over Abu Abdullah. So he returns, he's dejected. His spiritual guide at that time, he comes to easier to go in through. He says, I've never made anybody cry. He says, it's fine, come sit with me. This is in his dream, of course. He says, come sit with me and just make me cry. He does so, and eventually Abu Abdullah be something that is undermined or overlooked. These days of Muharram are a time for us to gather as many blessings as possible. Just like we say of Ramadan. We say that it's the banquet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we must gather as many blessings as we can from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during this time, and so on. And this time, brothers and sisters, this is the banquet of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. This is the spread of Abu Abdullah. This is his invitation to you. He's sending you to come forth and gather as many blessings as you can for the next year. Of course, that doesn't mean that we neglect Abu Abdullah throughout the year and he only exists in Muharram and Safar. But it means that at least during this time when our attention is towards Abu Abdullah, so over the last few nights we've been mentioning two things. We mentioned Iman and Amal. That is, faith and action. One cannot be without the other. These two build each other up together. We mentioned that in order for one to have action towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they must have something called taqwa. That which means that we perform what is enjoined upon us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and refrain from what is forbidden for us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But one thing that we have forgotten, brothers and sisters, is that faith is one of the most important things. If you are trying to act on what you have been told to do without faith in who you're following, it's not going to happen. Many of us, we have our subjective gods. Each of us has a different imagination of Allah. One of us might see Allah as a vengeful Lord, one who's always out to get you. While the other person might see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an entirely merciful God. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is entirely merciful, but to the extent where they think that the objective Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. We have to understand who He is in His truth. Because this is something that's going on quite a lot nowadays, Everybody has their own opinion, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. There's always a subjective reality. So, in order for us to truly become proper Muslims, we have to understand who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is first, that take man up to God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you take one away, if you just have Iman but you don't have Amal, then you're going to be flying with one wing. If you have just Amal without Iman, which many of us do, it's normal. We don't have a proper understanding of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. If we have Amal without Iman, then when we're praying, all we're doing is putting our heads into sajda all the time, that's all. It's nothing special. Once your foundation is correct, then you can build. Otherwise, if you build, and there's no foundation, that house is going to get washed away, it's going to crumble down. So what's most important, brothers and sisters, is that we have a proper understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and of Tawheed. What is the saying of Tawheed? If anybody La ilaha illallah, right? When we have La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah can be cut into two pieces. We can have La ilaha and then illallah. Our first job, brothers and sisters, is to remove any gods. La ilaha. No God other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No deity. So, if we have La ilaha, let's take it. Anything that we put above Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes our God. And perhaps you might be thinking, okay, idols or, I don't know, a cow or whatever. But no. A false deity could be anything that you decide to put over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you to pray on time. But England's playing against Spain, Sunday. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you to fast during the month of Ramadan. I've got exams, I can't fast. With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that becomes your false deity. You have enough money to go to Hajj, you have all of the conditions to go on Hajj. But you want to buy a house, so you put that money into your saving instead. Of course, unless you actually really, really need that money. You go on Hajj. Zakat, khums, you can find an example for every single one of these. Every single one of these wajibat that we have, you can find an example. So we have to be careful, brothers and sisters, that before we try to fit illallah into our lives, we have la ilaha already. We have to get rid of all false deities before we bring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into our lives. Otherwise we're doing an injustice to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Memory from all of our minds. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most merciful of the merciful. Telling everyone, even those stubborn and obstinate against him, He looks at them like those who are, rebellious children. I'm sure many of you have had children, when your child starts to disobey, you're not just gonna, get rid of him and, get a new model. No. You work with the child, you develop him, you raise him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like this, He gives you chance after chance after chance after chance. And sometimes when we complain about our bala'as, our calamities that befall us, we don't realize that those are actually learning curves that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting for us. Just how, I don't know, you put your son into timeout. Or you tell your daughter she has extra chores. I don't know, I don't have kids, I don't know how to discipline a child. But you give him those disciplines, correct? You give her those disciplines. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does when He gives us those calamities. A gentle reminder to put you back into the right path. So inshallah, with the loudest of salawat ala Muhammad, we will begin our today's discussion. We forgot one specific one, which is the taqwa of the heart. It's the beginning where you begin from, your inside. You reform yourself, as some of the brothers who were at Friday prayers today, I mentioned. You reform yourself first before you begin to reform society. It doesn't make sense. Somebody who doesn't have something cannot provide it for somebody. So first of all, you need to fix yourself before you can enact it within your body, within your being. The first thing that one must do is purify his intentions when he observes taqwa. Many a time we see that when we work, when we do things, we're not doing them for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore we do not get that thawab from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, إِنَّ الْعَبْدَ يَعْمَلُ الْعَمَلَ الَّذِي هُوَ لِلَّهِ رِضًا فيريد به غير الله فلو أنه أخلص لله لجاء. But he does it for somebody other than Allah. His intention is for the pleasure of somebody else. And he continues to say, if only he had been sincere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he would have reached what he desired. Give me an example of something that is the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Prayer? Akhlaq.
Feeding the poor.
And that goes under charity, but yeah. But you see, all of the examples you have given are all under the umbrella of Islam. Every single example, charity, it's advised by Islam. Feeding the poor, advised by Islam. Salah, enjoined by Islam. But when it says an act that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any act that you perform for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an act that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as long as it's not sinful. You could be going to work and you could say, Fi sabilillah, I'm working, to bring that money back for my family and to sustain my family. Fi sabilillah, I'm eating so that I can nourish my body to work in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fi sabilillah, I'm sleeping so that I can have the energy to work in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every single thing you do can be made into something you do for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Your intentions are the most important thing, and this is what leads to taqwa of the heart. Is that every single thing you do is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Which I guess could be our practical step for today, inshallah. Is that whenever we do something, we ensure that before we make that niyyah that, for example, I'm not going to work because my boss told me to, I'm going to my work, fi sabilillah, so that I can raise money and make money for my family so that they can live, in peace. I didn't use the word comfort because comfort's a very difficult word in Islam. Should we be in comfort? Maybe we'll discuss it over the next few nights. Maybe I'll bring the hadith, inshallah. Maybe I'll mention the hadith now. The hadith says that Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he asked his companions, he says, why do you wish for the impossible? And the companions say, which rational person would ever wish for something that's impossible? And he said, you do. And the companions say, how so? He replies, because you wish for comfort in this world. A mu'min will never be comfortable in this world. We see the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says, "Ad-dunya sijnul." Where he says, "Ad-dunya sijnul mu'min." The dunya is the prison of the mu'min. Very beautifully, one of the shuhada, he mentions that he flips it on its head. He flips the equation on its head. Rather than saying that the world is the prison of the believer, he says that the world is actually the playground of the believer and the hell for the disbeliever. Because while the disbeliever is going towards, haram and enjoyment and pleasure in this life, the believer is working towards establishing his house, his eternal house in the next life. So we have to remember, brothers and sisters, that although comfort is fine for a believer to have, it mustn't be something that stops you from reaching your main goal, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and achieving His pleasure in this life. It says in the Holy Quran that your wealth and everything will be used as a trial against you. Nothing is greater than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and doing your duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think I gave the example of the shuhada, how they were so young. Some of them were 24, 25 at the peak of their youth, yet they severed their ties they severed their attachment, rather than their ties, they severed their attachment from their wives, their young children, their fathers, their mothers, their brothers, their sisters. They severed their ties from them, and they went and they gave their life for the sake of the Ahlul Bayt. This is what it means about not having those ties to the world and not having comfort. It's fine for you to have, your nice car, your nice house, as long as you do not put it above Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the main thing, brothers and sisters. So please recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil.
Moving on from the taqwa of the heart, let's see what Imam Sayyid alayhi salam mentions in the treatise of rights. He says regarding the eyes, he says, وَأَمَّا حَقُّ بَصَرِكَ أَن تُغْمِضَهُ عَمَّا لَا يَحِلُّ لَكَ وَتَعْتَبِرَ بِالنَّظَرِ بِهِ. As for the right of your sight, it is to lower it from what is not lawful for you to view, and to learn a lesson from what you see. Inshallah, tomorrow we'll discuss the first part, but today, inshallah, we'll discuss about taking a lesson from what you see. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, he mentions the word abara. Abara means to take lesson, or to take admonition, essentially, from what has happened in your life. It means you don't lose your cane twice. It means that when something happens to you, when something happens to another person, you take lesson from that, and you continue and you move on. There's an ayah of the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Imran, it says, قَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ آيَةً فِي فِئَتَيْنِ الْتَقَتَا فِئَةً تُقَاتِلُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَأُخْرَى كَافِرَةً يَرَوْنَهُمْ مِثْلَيْهِمْ رَأْيَ الْعَيْنِ وَاللَّهُ يُؤَيِّدُ بِنَصْرِهِ مَن يَشَاءُ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَعِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ. He says there was certainly a sign for you, yani the believers, in the two armies that met. This is talking about the Battle of Badr. He said when the mu'mineen were only 313 and the disbelievers were close to 1,000 soldiers. So he says that one army was fighting in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the other army was faithless. But when the army came to them, when the armies came together, the enemy viewed the army of Islam as twice as many as they were, because of their faith. He continues to say, Allah strengthens whomever He wishes with His help. We see this now, don't we, in the events of Gaza, that regardless of how oppressed the people of Gaza are, for 9 months, the imposing army has not been able to eradicate them. The strength of the people of Gaza is not a worldly strength. It's a strength that is granted by their faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel, right? Allah is enough for us, they keep saying. When your trust is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah becomes your support. There's a hadith from Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam where he mentions that the one who has nobody but fair, oppressing the one who has nobody to call out to apart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a very, very profound hadith. The oppressed has a very high position in Islam. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
He further says in the Holy Quran, he says, there is indeed admonition for those who have insight, basira. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about those who have basira, ulil absar. Now, what is basira? Basira is the ability to investigate matters that happen before you, things that happen before you, events, information. By only contemplating. There are a few examples of this. One of those was, again, one of the brothers of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, of course from the hadith that we mentioned. It was the hadith that we mentioned of Rasulullah, where he says that the brothers of Rasulullah are those who believe in him without even seeing him. And we mentioned that these are none but the shuhada and the ulama. He mentions in the Holy Quran the shuhada wa siddiqeen. So one of those was Sayyid Ibrahim Hadi, one of the big shuhada from the Iran-Iraq war. Then he said that, the narrator says that I went with him to one of these programs where they celebrate Eid al-Zahra. And of course Eid al-Zahra is affiliated with other things. For example, the alleged, killing of the second Khalif, which is not proven to be Eid al-Zahra either. So they go to this event, and then they're sitting there, and then suddenly the reciter, he starts to use foul language against the second Khalif. In an open gathering where brothers and sisters of the Ahlul Sunnah are coming in this, and they're witnessing this. So Shaheed Ibrahim Hadi is visibly getting very annoyed, he's getting upset. So he goes and he tells his friend, come, we have to leave now. And his friend said, no, let's stay for a little bit. He said, no, we're going now. So when they leave, he tells his friend, never stay in gatherings like this. Don't affiliate with gatherings like this. They're not the right kinds of gatherings. The narrator, he says, I didn't realize what he was talking about. I didn't know what he was talking about, It was a bit strange for me. He said, but later on when I understood and when I heard the words of the ulama mentioning about how important it is to maintain unity between our two madhahib, I understood how insightful Ibrahim was, that from all the way back then, he understood this issue, but it wasn't even such a big issue at that time, in the 1980s. Of course now it's a big issue, as we mentioned yesterday. Hussein, and becoming shuhada on the path of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. There are other narrations we see in history, not other examples. For example, when Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam was signed the treaty with Muawiyah. For those of you who don't know, after the Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam earned the Khilafah, he received the Khilafah after the martyrdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He became the Khalif, and then many of his commanders betrayed him, and they went and they started fighting for Muawiyah. Muawiyah bought them essentially. Eventually he had no choice but to sign this peace treaty for reasons that inshallah, there are many good books that you can read. Inshallah, I will not delve into that because it's a very, very extensive discussion as to why Imam al-Hasan would sign such a treaty. But the problem is that people could not understand the insight behind why Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam would sign such a treaty. They saw it as a humiliation for the believers. They used to call him, na'udhu billah, mudillul mu'mineen, the person who humiliated the believers. In the streets of Medina, as they would walk past him, they would say, Assalamu alaikum, mudillul mu'mineen. The people, they had such a lack of insight that when they found out that Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam was about to sign this treaty, they raided his tent. They went into his tent, they ripped the prayer mat from underneath his feet. It's a lack of insight, brothers and sisters. They had no understanding, no political understanding of what was going on. Remember how we mentioned that Islam is not just a religion of, Allah, Allah. And we tend to think it is, worship. No. It's a societal religion, it's a political, a socio-political religion. And a complete lifestyle of a religion. It teaches you every single thing that you need to live a godly life in this world. And the next, of course. There are other examples. For example, one night Imam Ali alayhi salam was leaving the masjid in Kufa, Masjid al-Kufa. And he's with his friend, his close companion, Kumayl ibn Ziyad. And they're walking home, and on their way home they come across al-akhirah wa yarju rahmati rabbih. Standing in prayer, taking care of his afterlife and in anticipation of the mercy of his Lord. And Kumayl, he starts to get enchanted by this recitation. He starts to think, wow, what a beautiful recitation this man has. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he turns back to him and he says, Kumayl, this man is a man of hellfire. Kumayl's astounded. He said, well, he recites so beautifully. I'm sure many of us have heard, Many of us have heard like some very, very beautiful recitals. There's also a very important thing that we be careful of these people as well. As we mentioned yesterday, of course. That just because their speech impresses you doesn't mean they are the right person to listen to. So, he hears this beautiful recitation and Imam Ali says he's a person of hellfire. Believe that Imam Ali alayhi salam shouldn't have. I'm not going to go into this because it's a very long discussion, and inshallah, hopefully in the future nights or maybe some other time we can discuss it. But the Khawarij were those who believed Imam Ali alayhi salam was not the rightful Khalif and he should do tawbah and so on and so forth. So after fighting in the Battle of Nahrawan with the Khawarij, Imam Ali alayhi salam takes Kumayl by his hand and he says, come with me, I want to show you something. They go through the battlefield amongst all of the killed and they find one body. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he points his sword at this body and he says, أَمَّنْ هُوَ قَانِتٌ عَنَاءِ اللَّيْلِ سَاجِدًا وَقَائِمًا يَحْذَرُ الْآخِرَةِ. He's telling him that this was the same man who was reciting so beautifully that he captured your heart with his recitation. But the thing is, brothers and sisters, that recitation was very, very base level. It was superficial. It wasn't something that was going into him. It wasn't something that he was absorbing. It was just something that he was reading. Like we read a novel or a storybook. So this is a double lesson for us, brothers and sisters, that we don't just read the Quran for the sake of reading the Quran. We read the Quran to learn what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to do and gain insight from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us. So, one main question now remains is that, okay, it's very nice to know what basira is, but how can I go towards basira? How can I achieve that basira that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants me to have? There is a hadith that says, Dawam al-ghifla ya'mal basira. That constant ignorance and constant neglect of your knowledge, your pursuit of knowledge, will blind your insight. The status of knowledge in Islam is something that has been very, very, very emphasized. It's something that has been mentioned on multiple occasions. I think I mentioned before of the hadith of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, where he says that if I see a young man in my Shia who is not learning his religion, I'll teach him myself. To that extent that the Imam is willing to teach him himself. It's such an important pursuit in the religion of Islam that you make sure you know your religion properly. You make sure you know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you properly. So, one thing they mention is, in the hadith is, كَيْفَ يَهْتَدِي مَنْ لَمْ يَبْصِرْ وَكَيْفَ يَبْصِرُ مَنْ لَمْ يَتَدَبَّرْ. This is how can the one who has no insight be guided to the right path? And how can the one who doesn't ponder have any insight? So there are two things that are dependent on each other. First of all, it is insight which is dependent on pondering. And then guidance is dependent on that insight. So brothers and sisters, I remember asking one of my teachers in Iran, one of the great akhlaq teachers, that how do we gain that ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do we get to know who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is? Because of course, how can you worship the one you do not know? As I mentioned at the beginning. And he said something very profound. He said that, he gave two very simple steps, but first of all he said if we were to go into this question properly, we'd have to, study 100, like have 100 hours of lessons to listen to learn this. But then after that he said, I'll simplify it to you, I'll give you two steps. He said the first thing is that you have to want it yourself. The first thing is that you have to want to know who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is yourself. And the second thing he mentioned is that when you look into the world, look all around you, he said you see ayah after ayah after ayah, sign after sign after sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, and you do not ponder upon these signs, it's as if you're doing na shukri to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ingratitude to Allah. You are not being grateful that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed all of these lessons for you to learn from. So he said what you can do in order to gain ma'rifah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, choose one thing, just a single thing, and think about it for 10 minutes a day. Think about it for 10 minutes a day. It could be water, it could be, your pet cat, it could be anything. Anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for you, just think about it. Just ponder upon it. Wonder about the blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted upon you through giving you this thing. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And on multiple occasions we see that basira is linked with ibra. Basira is dependent on basira. I said basira is dependent on basira. I did, didn't I? Basira is dependent on ibra. And ibra is also dependent on basira. To take lesson from the events that happen around you. To understand that when something comes across your table, or something comes into your DMs on Instagram, somebody messages you something, oh my God, look what's happened in so and so and so. Or you're scrolling on TikTok and you find, oh my God, look, this has happened. You don't start sharing it immediately. Wait. Do your research. Think about it. Don't take rash decisions. This is basira. Basira means having that insight to wait. And sami'a fatafakkar. This is the hadith of Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, the basir is the one who listens, he hears, and then he ponders upon what he's heard. Is it correct or is it wrong? Nowadays we have this culture of following. That everybody wants to just follow what the other person is doing. It's just going along with what everybody else is doing. A hive mind almost, We've got to the extent where anybody can be anything now because of this. Just because it's something that's being mentioned, and everybody has, as we mentioned, the right to have their own opinions above the opinion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Today anyone can be anything they want to be. I will not go into it anymore. So rather than just accepting it because it's being said, rather than just accepting it because, I heard it on the news, rather than just accepting it because, we have to wait and we have to think. How many times on the news have we been told again and again and again, through BBC and so on, that, perhaps Palestine isn't exactly what we think, the situation in Palestine isn't exactly as we think it is, or, the big bad Iran coming to beat you with a stick all the time. This is the biggest thing that happened 2 years ago, brothers and sisters, during the riots in Iran. They like to call them protests here. They were not protests. I was there myself. I witnessed it myself. They were riots in the biggest mention, the biggest, truest meaning of the word. Destroying ambulances, killing people on the streets, ripping people's hijab off. This isn't a protest. This is a riot. And the reason why this happened in Iran was because of the lack of basira, brothers and sisters. Was because the enemy was pushing this narrative continuously. The people were being misinformed, and due to their prejudices, rather than thinking about it and taking a step back and saying, wait a second, perhaps that girl wasn't actually killed. Perhaps she had an underlying condition from beforehand, which is something they didn't mention in the news here. The person who died when she was, like, or as they claim, she was hit on her head, but there's no video evidence or anything like the such. It's just a claim that was made, which has now become the narrative that, Mahsa Amini was killed, which is not true. And overlooking the fact that she had an underlying condition, a brain condition from before, that made her prone to collapsing. Rather than looking at these facts, they went by their prejudices. They followed what the BBC was filling them with, what Voice of America was filling them with, all these kinds of things. Completely overlooking their basira that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them, and they went to the streets and started destroying everything. Killing people, brothers and sisters. I mentioned one of them the other day, Sayyid Arman Ali Verdi. The way they martyred him was savage. They gathered around him and they beat him until he was dead. A'udhu billah. The same thing happened with another of the Shahada, Shaheed Ruhallah Ajamiyan, in the middle of the street. They just beat him to death. They stabbed him to death. A surgeon, brothers and sisters. Not one of these riffraff of the streets. A surgeon was the one who was the main culprit of the main culprit who killed him. An educated individual. This is the lack of basira, brothers and sisters, that is threatening us at every single stage. So we have to be careful. We seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a lack of basira. Sallallahu Muhammad wa Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So as Imam Sajjad alayhi salam says, it is the right of our eye to look at that which we can learn from, that which we can gain intellect from, that which we can gain knowledge from. On the other hand, we must not fill our eyes with that which we are prohibited from. There's a saying from one of the Shahada who was the defender of the shrine. His name was Shaheed Muhammad Hadi Zulfaghari. He was only about 23, 24 when he gave his life protecting the shrines in Samarat. It's a very interesting story about his life is that it seemed as if his life was intertwined with Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam. He was born in the Shahada of Imam Hadi. He wanted to go and protect the shrine of Sayyid Zainab alayhi salam. They didn't give him permission because he was a student of the Hawza. So where did he go and he went to protect instead? He protected the shrine of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam. And he went and he was made shaheed in this path. There's a saying from him, he says, the eyes of the sinner are not worthy of martyrdom. If you want to, as I mentioned, I believe I mentioned a few nights ago, is that in order for you to reach that stage where you can eventually be martyred, you must live like the martyr first. To be a martyr, you must live as a martyr, the saying is. So, if the eyes of the sinner are not worthy of martyrdom, this means that, brothers and sisters, we must protect our eyes from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden us from. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
But inshallah we'll leave that for tomorrow. I don't want to go over my time like I usually do. Inshallah tonight we'll be discussing two individuals from the land of Karbala. Two people who were accustomed with the tradition of martyrdom. Two people who grew up in the household of martyrdom. Perhaps they weren't even born. They surely weren't born. When their grandfather Ja'far al-Tayyar, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him, was martyred in the Battle of Mu'tah. Martyred in the Battle of Mu'tah against the Roman Empire. And he was granted the title Al-Tayyar by Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi after his two arms were severed in the battle. And Rasulullah said that he will be flying with the angels with two emerald wings in the skies. Perhaps they weren't alive when they witnessed the martyrdom of Fatima al-Zahra alayha salam. Perhaps they weren't alive when they witnessed the martyrdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah wa salamu alayhi took place. Perhaps they weren't even alive when they witnessed, perhaps they weren't even alive to witness the betrayal of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. Perhaps they were not old enough to even witness this. Perhaps, brothers and sisters, all they witnessed was the love and the care of the family of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. From their very beginning, they were nurtured with the love of the Ahlul Bayt. They were nurtured with the love of Imam al-Hasan. They were nurtured with the love of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. It mustn't be easy, brothers and sisters, that on a day where 30,000 people have surrounded your uncle, 30,000 people have encircled a man who perhaps maybe you weren't even that close to during your life, or perhaps he wasn't your father, perhaps he wasn't even your uncle. According to some narrations, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the grandson, Aoun and Muhammad, we are talking about. Muhammad, they say, was not the son of Sayyida Zainab. Aoun was the son of Sayyida Zainab. Muhammad had a distant connection to Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam in this case. So it boggles the mind as to how he would lay down his life for the sake of this individual. We see that on the day of Ashura, Abdullah ibn Ja'far, he says that he could not go himself. So he sent his two sons, very young sons. Narrations, our reliable narrations put their age around 15 or 16 years old. I don't know how many of us could perhaps say that when I was 15 or 16 I would even be able to even ponder laying down my life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, laying down my life for the sake of my uncle. But that was what these two men enacted. Sallallahu alaykum ya ahl bayt an-nubuwwah wa ومختلف الملائكة وخزان العين ومنتهى الحياة. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon you, my beloved Holy Prophet and the Ahl al-Bayt. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon you. It was in your homes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed us with guidance and revelation. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon you. Angels descended upon you day in and day out, seeking permission before entering upon you. Brothers and sisters, imagine yourself before the Zari of Imam al-Husayn and repeat with me, Sallallahu alayka ya Abdullah sallallahu alayka ya madloom, sallallahu alayka ya Sayyid bi ardi Karbala. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon you, my beloved Imam Al-Hussein. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon you, my oppressed Imam. May Allah's peace and blessings be upon you, O the Imam who was slaughtered by the shores of the Euphrates, while your lips were dry from thirst. Sallallahu alayka, sallallahu alayk, sallallahu alayk. Imam al-Rida alayhi salam said to Rayyan ibn Shamim, Ya ibn Shamim, in kunta bakiyan li shay'in famki ala al-Husayn, فإنه ذبح كما يذبح الكبش. O son of Shabib, if you are to mourn upon anyone, then mourn upon Hussein, for he was slaughtered as they slaughter the sheep. Sallallahu alayka ya madloom, sallallahu alayka ya Al-Ajal. Imam al-Hussein has no more companions. They've all laid down their lives. Ali al-Akbar has gone to the battlefield. He's had to bring back the body of his beloved son. At that moment, two men come to Abu Abdullah. He says to Abu Abdullah, do I have permission to go? Abdullah looks at this young man. He sees that he looks like his grandfather Ja'far. He says, are you sure you don't want to leave? The 15-year-old Muhammad, he insists, Ya Abu Abdullah, I want to give my life for you. He rushes to the battlefield. He fights bravely. At that moment, Abu Abdullah has someone called from the battlefield. عليك مني السلام يا أبا عبد الله. Perhaps at the moment that Muhammad fell from his horse, perhaps at that moment he saw Ja'far al-Tayyar coming to him. Perhaps Ja'far called out to him and said, welcome back, my son. Then Abu Abdullah, it's not over, ya Abu Abdullah. Aoun ibn Abdullah, the son of Sayyid Zainab, ya Zainab, 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 Zainab. He comes to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. Abu Abdullah looks at him. He cannot believe what he can see. The son of his beloved Zainab is standing before him. Perhaps you can remember the Masa'ib of Ali al-Akbar when the women refused to let him go. But with Aun ibn Abdullah, Sayyid Zainab's own son, she says, go and protect your uncle. Abu Abdullah, he sends him to the battlefield. He fights bravely. He kills many of the enemy. If we can go back to the Masa'ib of Ali al-Akbar, when he falls off the horse, when Ali al-Akbar falls from the horse, Sayyida Zainab runs from the tent. She says, Ya akhi wa ibn akhi, oh my brother and the son of my brother. But when Aun ibn Abdullah falls from his horse and he calls out, Sallallahu alayka ya Abu Abdullah, when Ja'far comes to collect his grandson, when Ja'far comes to receive the torn apart body of Aun, what does Sayyida Zainab do? Sayyida Zainab stays in her tent. Perhaps she sits on her prayer mat and she thanks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this sacrifice. Abu Abdullah, he goes around, he places his head in his lap. He places his head in his lap and he closes his eyes for the final time, looking at Abu Abdullah's beautiful face. أما لا يوم كيومك يا أبا عبد الله. There is no day like yours, Ya Abu Abdullah. والشمر جالس على صدره مولغ سيفه على نحره. زينب زينب زينب. She's watching from above. She's watching from the Tall al-Zainabiyya. What does she witness? She sees Shibr sitting on the chest of Abu Abdullah. And what does Zara Nahya say? It says he is quenching his sword with your blood. Sallallahu alayki ya mazlum, sallallahu alayki ya atshan. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الكافرين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوا على محمد وآله الطاهرين.
Dear brothers and sisters, we're going to pray Salah first, and after Salah we're going to complete our, Matam, we're going to do Matam.